I do feel as if it's quieter now. It used to be very loud and harsh to me. Okay. All right. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I am going to keep an eye on the waiting room. So for the first couple of minutes, I'll be a little choppy. That could just be because I'm myself, or it could be that. So thank you all for coming and joining us today. This is the first in a three-part series about different parts of the federal legislative process. There are places where it's different. There are places where it's really similar to the state of Missouri. Today is the most similar to the state, I think. And then by Thursday, we're going to get to a place where it really doesn't look like the state at all. So that'll be a fun process. Empower Missouri historically has focused mostly on state level legislative change. Certainly in 2016 to 2020, we did quite a lot of federal advocacy, and we anticipate we're going to need to do a lot more in the coming years for reasons that are likely quite apparent to you. So we wanted to start with just like a base level training in that process. It is not likely that I'll do this again anytime soon. However, we are going to send out recordings at the end of these 3 days. So if you need to miss any portion, that's all right. They build on each other, but they are not like interrelated strongly. So you can miss a day and kind of watch it next week or whatever after our lovely comms team gets it out to your inbox moving forward. If you've not been through a training with me before, I'm Sarah Owsley. I'm the advocacy director here at Empower. I always share that I have lots and lots of children, so many children that I say I have a lot of children, and then they ask how many children that is, and then I tell them, and then they're like, oh, that is a lot of children. I have that number of children. So I get interrupted often and am able to get right back on topic really quickly. So if you have a question in the moment, put it in the chat box, or you can kind of come off mute, interrupt me. There's a chance it may be coming, right? So if you want to leave it in the chat box, that's okay. But if it feels really urgent, feel free to interrupt me. I can get right back on topic relatively quickly myself. I will tell you, this is the first time I've done these trainings. It always takes 1 or 2 times for me to kind of get all the kinks worked out. So I appreciate your patience with me today as we learn this all together as we move forward. Here's our agenda for today. We're going to talk about the triangle of stability, which is absolutely a thing I half stole from NPR and half made up on my own. Then we're going to talk about the federal legislative process, policies for that process, the role of advocates, and the role of judicial review. So here is the triangle of stability. This kind of came from, I was listening to an interview on NPR, and a person was talking about some of the executive orders that have come through. And she said basically, like, if policymaking is a triangle, it's at the top because it's the least steady. Like, it is much easier to alter and change. And so I thought, well, that's a great way to sort of structure how we're going to cover these 3 days. We are, sort of not going to talk a lot about constitutional changes. They're really rare and really difficult, right? I think most of us are probably familiar with the Constitution and the process and the way that we can change that process. We're going to start today with legislation instead. Tomorrow we'll cover the budgetary process, and then we'll move into executive action and regulation as sort of the like most stable to the least stable ways that policy are made at the federal level. You'll see here judicial review kind of runs throughout and is the base. And so every day we'll talk about how the judicial system interacts with that process of policymaking and sort of is the inherent checks and balances that exists in our, in our Constitution and in our policymaking process to keep things from getting too far out of hand, though I think many of us may feel that we are already a little too far out of hand. We'll see. So the legislative process is what we're going to start with today. It is very similar, but not exactly the same as the state level process. So if you have a good understanding of that, a lot of this will feel familiar. There are different levers and places that advocates can influence that is different than at the state level. And so there are some changes there, but this should feel relatively familiar. If you are not sure what the lawmaking process is at the state level, that is also fine. I'm not going into it with an assumption that you do, and we're going to cover it all pretty thoroughly. Working policy change through the legislative process is slow. It takes a long time. It is moderately difficult. It is something that you'll be able to get a decent-ish grasp on today. There will be all sorts of things that could change, or, secret things that they just aren't very common, right? That might come up over time. So you're not an expert after an hour, but you will get a pretty decent grasp on it. And it is somewhat influenceable because our elected officials are elected, and theoretically they should care what we have to share with them. And so we should have some level of influence there. Like I said, it's a relatively stable way to make policy. That is because there are inherent balances between the House and the Senate that help to increase our voices as advocates and increase the voices of elected officials who are influencing that policymaking process. There is not a way where senators can only do their way and House members can only do their way, and then right, like that's the end. They have to work together. There has to be some level of compromise, and it has to exist across all the elected officials for the entire country. About 300 pieces of legislation are passed every 2-year session at the federal level. Some of those may be of really little impact to most of us. Some of them may be of significant impact to a lot of us. So I was surprised when I heard it was 300 pieces of legislation each 2 years. That felt like a lot more than what I hear about as a relatively informed person. And so that might be true for you all as well. However, that's only about 7% of the bills that are filed in those 2-year periods. So they pass a pretty significant, I feel like, amount of legislation each year or every 2 years, but it's very little compared to what is filed. That probably feels very similar to the Missouri process. That's pretty similar there. And most of the time, when legislation makes it through the whole congressional process, legislative process, and is signed or the veto is overturned, that language is like pretty set in stone. It's not easily changed. Sometimes it requires another bill to change it. There may be some flexibility within it in some of the other processes we'll learn throughout this week, but for the most part, they're not easily changed. It's a slow, deliberative process on purpose that is designed to help balance the needs of lots of our community members. So the legislative branch has 2 bodies. It is one branch together and theoretically both bodies hold the same level of power, right? There are really 2 processes by which the Congress passes policy in the US. The legislative process is what we're going to talk about today. The budgetary process, which is very hot news right now, is what we will talk about tomorrow. So if you have questions today about like how this might change through a budgetary process, et cetera, we're going to talk really in depth tomorrow all about the budget. So hold on to those questions, and ideally they'll be already answered, but you can also ask questions as we go. So the U.S. Congress is bicameral. I always think about, is anybody else a New Girl fan? There's that one episode of New Girl and Brooklyn Nine-Nine where they were like, it was a crossover, and Zooey Deschanel, she yells, "It's a crossover." So every time I'm like, it's bicameral. So there's a House and a Senate, right? There's 2 bodies with one within the U.S. Congress. We expect the Senate to be a little more deliberative and equal, right? They are really designed to be a slower process that should theoretically be paying more attention to kind of the full state's needs, because it's equal representation, right? Each state has 2 senators. They are at least the age of 30. They serve in 6-year terms, so they're there a lot longer without needing to campaign again. And so it's like a little bit more steady, consistent, right? We kind of like think about the Senate in that way. The House is really their job is to serve more of like the popular opinion or what their specific district might be thinking or wanting, because there's a lot more House reps than there are senators, right? The representation within the House is based on population. Missouri has 8, so that's an amount that's pretty good. They're usually a little younger. Minimum age there is 25, and they serve 2-year terms. So they're coming back up for reelection really regularly. They're much more in tune with like right now on the ground, my neighbors, what they're wanting. And that's a good balance, right? If you think about like a good marriage, possibly that might be an example in your mind, right? Like somebody is usually more stable and somebody is a little bit more hectic. And that is a great way to sort of balance and come to a good process at the end. Here is an image that I stole off the internet of the legislative process. This feels overwhelming to me. It might feel overwhelming to you all, but as you start to read, you start to see that actually like most of these steps are the same, which is very similar to the Missouri conference or Missouri lawmaking process. Bills are filed in the House or the Senate. They get a bill number. They're assigned to committee. They may go to a subcommittee. Almost always they'll have a subcommittee. At the federal level, there'll be a hearing there. Committee hearings at the federal level are public in that usually you can watch them, but they are not like any advocate can come and offer testimony. They have to be invited to those committees to offer testimony. It's usually a really formal process, a lot more difficult, but that's a process we can watch. There's a lot of changes often that are made in the committee process, just like at the state level. They will pass out with the committee markups, the subcommittee markups, and then the full committee markup. It'll move into either a rules committee, right, in the House or in the Senate, just goes straight to the floor. Action happens in the floor. Something happens with it, right? They pass the bill. It goes to a conference committee, which is how they sort of like reconcile the two versions. And then it is offered to the president for veto or signature. If it's vetoed, it can get overturned. If it's, not, right, then that becomes the law. So that's sort of an overview of the legislative process, which was very quick. So I'm going to give folks just a second to digest that. Sip my cold water. There are different rules in the House and the Senate that sort of help balance those two priorities. So rules in the Senate are really going to prioritize each individual senator, their involvement and their comfort. Senators can all offer amendments, including ones that may be relatively unrelated to the bill itself. It's difficult but possible to end a filibuster in the Senate. Debate is not limited, right? So they have an unlimited amount of time to debate in the Senate until or unless a filibuster is ended through cloture. That's the process to end a filibuster and force a vote. Every standing senator on the Senate side who wants to discuss a bill has to be able to do that. After cloture, there's a period of time where they are still allowed to debate. The vote doesn't happen immediately. So even when they've ended debate, there's still some amount of time where senators are going to continue to talk, even if their viewpoint may or may not be considered at that point. The majority leader has the responsibility to bring bills to the floor for debate. The Senate will vote on a bill. So they will not just say, we're going to, like this is the Senate leader the majority leader can't say, this is the bill we're going to vote on. Instead, they say, do you want, basically, like, do you consent to debate, to vote on this bill? And then they vote to vote on the bill, right? Those kinds of processes are meant to slow it down, are meant to be more deliberative, right? If the vote to vote on the bill fails, we would consider that bill dead. They cannot bring it for another vote to vote. Usually the Senate does a roll call vote, but that doesn't always happen. They can do a voice vote. They have to request a roll call vote. Usually there are plenty of senators who want that, and so it usually happens, but it's not always. Budget bills, you cannot cloture. So you cannot end a debate on a budget bill. They don't have the same process. Or excuse me, they do. Budget bills cannot be filibustered. There is no cloture because they have a limited amount of time that you can debate on them. That's part of the rules of the budget bills as they move forward. So they are not open for endless debate and they are not able to be filibustered. They also cannot be killed in this process. They have to be altered and then brought back to the floor. Those are the rules, except when they're not the rules, right? Time agreements can be made before debate begins to sort of faster pass a bill. but it must be unanimously agreed to, and it usually is. There is less like there's a lot of political fighting that happens in the Senate, right? But less in the process because senators really have an understanding that if we don't agree to if this bill is not going to get heard if it doesn't have a time agreement. And so usually there's some level of coordination and cooperation in order to bring those bills forward. Unanimous agreement can be used before the bill is brought up. It can be used to limit debate time. It can be used to limit the subject, which is not uncommon. So we're going to bring this bill forward. As I said, right, amendments don't have to be related to the language in front of them, but they might make an agreement before the bill is brought forward for debate to say, like, we're only going to talk about this topic, right? We're only going to do this thing. Doesn't have to be, but it usually does. It often does. Like I said, cloture can end debate during a filibuster, but they get 30 hours after that point to continue debating. So they may choose cloture, they may choose to end the filibuster, and still senators may continue to offer testimony or discuss the bill even beyond that time, which is confusing, I think, for a lot of advocates. Like, you all said you were done with this, like, let's be done with it, right? The Senate rules give them 30 extra hours. That is often, right, like overnight. It's clearly more than a full day later. I think the original intention is to sort of like let things cool, give senators a chance to kind of discuss in the background. They don't have to debate publicly during that time. It just, they have to wait those 30 hours to take the vote. And so often that happens. And then there's a lot of like backroom situations, as always happens within the lawmaking process, and always feels like a mixed bag for advocates, right? Usually the majority leader will ask for unanimous consent to call a bill to the floor. So, right, like they agree, they vote to vote on the bill. That is another way to sort of get everyone on board. Instead of pushing things through in the Senate by majority rule, it's much more common that there's some amount of agreement, there's some amount of working together in order to be the most successful on the Senate side, keeping that sort of decorum and that like value of each individual senator having importance and weight and being heard out. This is one of the ways that they do that in sort of an informal fashion. Any questions? Great. Some special things senators get to do, or the body of the Senate gets to do. They get to investigate stuff. There are hearings and trials. They often lead some of that investigation. There are some things that the Congress also is able to investigate. Senate is the only body that is able to consider and approve treaties. Fairly rare. Hasn't happened in a hot minute, but still there, fun to know. The Senate is the high court of impeachment. So they are able to consider the evidence, hear witnesses, and vote to acquit or convict that impeached individual. The House is who begins that impeachment process, as we'll learn here in a moment. The Senate also is able to confirm nominees. So all federal judges in the judicial branch, U.S. attorneys and U.S. marshals, specified officers in cabinet level departments. So only some, right? Not all of them, but sometimes the leaders of independent agencies, military service, foreign service, and uniformed civilian services. Some of those offices are Senate confirmed. That's how you'll know whether or not those are Senate confirmed places. The House does not confirm nominees, and it's not involved in that process. That is another part of the, like, they're in office for a lot longer, so they have some special stuff they get to do. We'll move over to the House now. The rules of the House really prioritize a popular vote. So there's a lot more places that, most folks want it. They can move that forward in the House in the way that is different than the Senate. It really prefers that individual's voice, right? Representatives are elected by a smaller number of people, so it makes some sense, right? They have a smaller viewpoint often on the implications to the full state. when they run for a Senate office, they, campaign in the full state. Theoretically, they should care what all of the members of the state are thinking. They have to make a choice, right? And I don't always agree with my next door neighbor about a thing. So I'm not going to always enjoy maybe the choice they made, or sometimes I'm really going to like it and my neighbor's going to dislike it. But it does make sense how a congressional member with a smaller group of people might have a little bit different viewpoint on how their vote needs to go. They move things much quicker in the House side, and they're less reliant on working together, right? So in the Senate, they're going to vote to vote. They're going to ask for unanimous consent before they bring a bill forward. In the House, that's not necessarily going to happen. They're pretty often just like sort of using strategic processes or those like smaller 51% majorities to kind of move things forward. There is not so much a spirit of camaraderie or trying to compromise in the House. Legislation is almost exclusively called for debate by the Speaker. So the Speaker of the House has a lot of that priority ability, a lot of voice over what happens there. And bills are introduced after a rule is proposed. So this is a sort of confusing process for folks. They will decide basically before something happens. They'll decide how they're going to debate. They're going to decide how much time is given to each side before that debate. Rules will say, yes, we're going to debate this bill and we're not going to offer any amendments, or we're going to debate this bill and no amendments can be offered. The House can be a little bit more difficult to follow. The word I originally used was sporadic, and Mallory was like, that's probably not the right word, and that might not be the right word, but the House can be more difficult to follow because sometimes they hear a bill and they can offer amendments. Sometimes they hear a bill and they can't offer amendments. Sometimes they hear a bill and, there's days of debate. Sometimes there's minutes of debate. Each bill is different because they decide on each rules of the bill before each bill is pulled forward. So it's not easy for me to say, like, they're going to debate until they don't anymore, right? They're going to debate as long as they've agreed to debate. Any questions about that? Great. The House has 4 sort of formal calendars, what we would consider, if we're looking at like the state process, the like 4 formal calendars, the places where bills go before they're called for debate. They'll come off these 4 calendars. The union calendar is going to be any bills that impact revenue or budget, right? Is it spending money? Is it going to impact the market? Is it going to have some sort of a fiscal impact? It's going to go on what's called the union calendar. The House calendar are things that don't have a fiscal impact. So they are, maybe law changes that are sort of outside of that, different things that just like are not going to cost money, are not going to impact revenue, and don't really have a like financial component. The private calendar is when basically like if you don't want to talk about the people who the bill is going to impact, it's a private calendar. So maybe it's national security, maybe it has to do with like individual people that we may not want to name, right? It could be an entity specific, right? Like some sort of TikTok, right? Like different things that are like private. That calendar is not open, right? So we're not seeing fully transparent into that calendar. And then there's a calendar of motions to discharge committees. Discharge committees. This is really super rarely used. It's a process to move a bill out of that committee without a vote from the committee. So one of the ways, right, that they may slow a bill down in the process would be that, House committee or subcommittee hears the bill, but then they never do anything with it. There's a strategy that very rarely is used, but by which leadership in the House could get that bill pulled forward anyway. Most of what we see is going to be on the union calendar, sometimes on the House calendar, pretty rarely used there, but I do remember a couple of years ago they did something there. The House sponsors all revenue and budget bills. They all start there. They initiate impeachment, but remember that the Senate is who does the investigation and makes the like final choices there. They can do some level of investigations. It depends on what what their investigating, right? Depends on what type of hearing they are leading. They still can compel testimony and issue subpoenas to folks. Interestingly, if the House, if none of the candidates for president receive enough electoral votes, the House elects the president, which is interesting. And if a vice president appointment is needed, the House does that as well. So if the VP steps down or something like that, the House is charged to appoint a new one. A little bit about the committee process at federal level. It's relatively similar to the state process. Committees are smaller groups of lawmakers who should have special knowledge of that topic, right? So we think about the committee on, criminal justice reform should have folks in it that are familiar with the criminal legal system. These smaller groups of lawmakers will hear bills before they move to the full body. They're able to change them. They're able to make recommendations. Almost always they do. And that process is called marking up the bill. So they'll start with the original bill language. They'll hear testimony. They'll do hearings. They might compel testimony. They might subpoena folks to talk about their expertise or viewpoints on these bills, et cetera. And then they'll change the language before they move it forward for a vote. And that's the process we call marking up. Most committee hearings are public, but we cannot really offer testimony like we can at the state level. This is the place at the state level where we go and offer testimony as advocates, as folks who are interested in this particular set of laws, right? That does not happen at the federal level. Folks are invited to offer testimony or compelled to offer testimony, but we don't just sort of show up and do that. Witnesses will submit a written copy of their testimony and then they answer questions. So they might make a short statement, but they don't sort of do what we're used to. Debate is almost always limited at the committee level. And witnesses are subject to at least 5 minutes per member, which is also pretty different, right? So generally, there's an agreement of how much time debate will take. That may be split amongst the members. Each member is given a specific amount of time. And that is when we'll hear, I'll yield the rest of my time to, whomever. That's the process by which that lawmaker says, I'm actually only going to use 2 minutes of my 5 minutes and the other 3 minutes, whoever we've coordinated.
Tell me when you're in front of the door.
Can handle that for us. Oh, yes. And then questioning can be extended up to 1 hour per member, but that is also the limit, right? So if there's 12 members in this committee, theoretically, there could be 12 hours of questioning. It has to be at least 5 minutes per lawmaker. It's a little bit different though, right? Hearings are usually public. The public is not able to testify. Hearings could be made private if there are enough votes and a good reason to do so. So they are public, off standard, but they could be voted to be made private. A small list of witnesses will be invited or compelled to offer testimony. Committees must meet at least once a month, so they can't just sort of sit there. That doesn't mean the committee hearings are very fruitful, but they happen. Bills are noticed up with at least 1 week of notice, also a little bit different than us, which also makes sense because folks got to fly in, they've got to come in, right? Bills are voted favorable, which we would call do pass, or unfavorable, which means they're no, right? They're not moving forward. They can also be tabled, which is we're just going to leave this here for a while. So we could come back to it, but if we have an unfavorable vote, that means they can't come back around to it. Usually in this process, if a bill has significant changes, and it's very different than what was originally filed, they'll usually give it a new bill number. That makes it a little more difficult for advocates to kind of follow along and see what is happening, but is a thing for us to kind of keep in mind. Any questions on the process before we move forward? We're clipping along at a nice pace, so some of you are going to have to come up with questions. Thought for sure there would be more. Okay. So the ways that advocates can influence, since we're not going to offer testimony, the process is a little bit more different, and always at the federal level, right? It feels farther away from us. It feels more difficult to access. That is true. That's just a truism, right, of the federal process. It is happening in a very far away place with lawmakers we very rarely interact with, which is different than more local processes. It's difficult to influence the federal lawmaking process. It's not impossible, however. And so some key places where we might be able to have our voices heard. The first step there is to find your representative. Oh, I'm so sorry, Jessica. I see your question in the chat box now. Um, no public testimony, or at least request to testify. Yeah, thanks for trying to help on the questions. Those are just the rules. They're in the US Congress. There's not public testimony. Folks have to be invited to testify. My guess would be that it's like about controlling what that looks like, right? It would be really easy to kind of take things off a little bit off topic or off process if they don't have an idea about how many folks are testifying or how long that process would take. We see that happen at the state level, right, where lawmakers are, sort of taken off guard, like, oh, 40 people showed up to offer testimony, like now our whole calendar is messed up. I think this idea that like each person gets a set number of time and possibly much longer sort of makes sense to me, that they don't just like open it up for public testimony at that point. I think also there's an expectation that the folks who are offering this testimony generally are in some way like a more demonstrated, proven expert in the field. And so folks who are more invested, who know more things, I can go and offer testimony about stuff that I'm completely unqualified to offer testimony about at the House level. And that probably feels very frustrating to lawmakers, and we don't recommend that you do that. But you could see why that might be a little bit more of a problem at the federal level, would be my guess. But I have no idea one way or another. Okay, so the ways we can influence all of these processes, right, start with knowing who are we needing to talk to and what do we need to talk to them about. And so start by finding your representative. Lots of places on the internet can do that with you. You can go to house.gov and find your representative. You'll enter in your zip code and they will tell you who your House and Senate reps are. So for this person, I entered in our office. Who did I enter? Oh, who does this end up being? Oh, yeah. So these are the Senate offices for someone. This is why I shouldn't do things a week in advance. Your local this is a senator's offices. I think Holly's maybe. So there's representative offices all over the area, and for your House rep, it'll be in your district. There will be in-district offices that will have staff who are local folks who staff those offices. You can build relationships with those staff members. Some of them might have a relatively close relationship with the elected official. Some of them never will meet the elected official. So ask some questions, right? When you build that relationship, they will tell you, though, like, this is the person you need to talk to them about housing policy. This is the person you need to talk to them about, SNAP or whatever else. They'll almost always have other folks who manage these different pieces of policy. And so like building that relationship with their staff is the best way. You're probably not calling Josh Hawley on the phone, right? But you might get to a place where you can call Josh Hawley's housing rep or, policy person. Not always the case, but sometimes it's possible. They do all have local offices. And so that's a good way. They do all have some path to speak to the elected official. I can't promise how close that relationship is, but it is there. So this one I put in our zip code in our office in Jeff City. The House member who covers that area is Bob Onder. I'm curious about his photo there, why exactly this is the profile picture there that Bob Onder chose, but I could guess things, I guess. But you'll see, right? He has a DC office, and then he has two offices here within his district. And that's going to be true for all of your elected officials. So building those relationships with those folks is good. In DC, there will be sort of a mix. You will have staff who have been in this field for a long time, right? Who are very smart, who have lots of connections, sort of just like the state level. They often like kind of move around. They usually stay within their own party, but they have a lot of expertise and relationships over time. Or you will get brand new staff who have kind of no idea what they're really doing in this role. This is a stepping stone into something else in their career. They may or may not have ever even been to Missouri, so may or may not be connected to the things that you are connected to. Um, so, as always, right, building that relationship will help you know, being discerning about those conversations will help you see, like, this is a person who's going to be valuable to me in my advocacy, or possibly like, I need to talk to whoever hired this person, not this person specifically, right? Thinking through that strategy is a really important part of good advocacy and part of the skills that we develop over time. Local staff is often staffed with like constituent services. So if you or your clients are having any problems with federal agencies, that's a good place to start. If you need help with disability or VA benefits, passports, any of those like kind of federal processes, if you as an individual or your clients need some help with that, that's a great place to go. Is not so much policy making advocacy, but is good advocacy work, right? They may have limited offices, right? Um, but someone does. Someone in that staff has the availability to reach those elected officials. That's why local offices are often targets for visibility campaigns or actions, right? I, as a person, have a level of power. I, as a person, a lawmaker is going to may or may not hear about, right? But when I show up with 100 people, that is a thing that is going to get to that elected official. That elected official may or may not care. I can't really say one way or another, but it that is a a thing to keep in mind. That's where we sort of like see a lot of that happening. We might send letters to those offices. We might show up in person, etc. And again, those folks can usually tell us who is the right person for us to talk to about this topic if it's not us. DC staff, right? Sometimes they've never been to Missouri. Sometimes they don't know a lot about it. Sometimes they can. Sometimes they can be really powerful allies. Sometimes those conversations are sort of exhausting and hyper partisan. The number of times I've been in those conversations where it's like, well, let me find a way to blame the other guy instead of like, let's actually just talk about the problem and the solution is a lot of times. That is just a truism. And we can still be effective in those places, right? Because it's not always, we want to listen to what those folks are saying back to us, but it is often about how we sell to them what is important to us. That's the work. And so advocates are pretty used to being in very frustrating conversations that may or may not feel super fruitful. You can reach out via Zoom or over the phone, particularly to those DC offices if in-person visits are not easy to achieve. And again, there are usually staff who are like, this is my particular topic area. Folks who don't have that sort of expertise might be a little more broad. And when you visit DC, those might be those first meetings that you have are kind of just whomever, right? Ideally, eventually you get to a place where you go to the actual elected official. That has happened for me several times on the Congress side, very, very rarely on the Senate side, right? So, or on the House side, excuse me. So ways to influence sort of more effective to less effective, but things you'll see advocates talk about, right? One email from me, probably not super effective. Lots of emails, a little bit more effective. Written letters that show up to an office, a little bit more effective. Lots of written letters that show up to an office, probably more effective. Phone calls are the same way, right? It is true that often those staff are just sort of like tasked with a tally mark, like you're calling to oppose this thing, you're calling to support this thing. They're probably not writing really detailed notes about the things that you're saying. And it is an opportunity for when lots of us make phone calls, right? We have lots of tally marks. And so that might be more effective. Meetings, talking with these elected officials, all the way into like visits and like face-to-face time with the official themselves or a high-ranking staff person are going to be more effective. Visibility campaigns that like let's get lots of eyeballs on them, right? Lots of things are harder to ignore than one. In-person activities are more effective, particularly when we also get some news coverage, when there's social media coverage, when there's earned media coverage, when we're like talking about it, right? Um, Media attention can be especially useful and is often a really good way to get some more eyeballs on the things that we're doing. Oh, Lulu, that's a very good question. Are there penalties for what's said in the letters, for example, threats or cannot be traced? So Empower is never going to recommend that we send any type of like threat or extremely hostile message to elected officials. That is true also at our federal level. I believe I really believe that it harms your entire cause to participate in something like that. I know if somebody comes to me and I disagree with them, even if I really firmly disagree with them, I'm going to listen to them. If they come to me with a threat or are like particularly difficult to speak to, I'm really not going to even listen, right? And so we really recommend that not be a thing that advocates engage in. I have no idea. I imagine it could be traced, right? These are federal agencies. Federal lawmakers are pretty well watched. I in no way thought that you were trying to do that. I just felt like I needed to say out loud not to do that. I assume folks could get fined or face some criminal, responses. Certainly ones, I think right now, right, everything is very, very heightened. And so I would imagine that they're following up on that sort of thing, but I don't really follow any folks even who would engage in that type of strategy. And so I always think probably don't do that.
Sarah, I'm curious in looking at like influence, I don't want to say like what is the data source of this because that's kind of hard to track, but like how do we kind of know that it's within the spectrum and how effective is it? Like, like if I have 10 visits with Josh Hawley, will he, like is he even gonna listen? Or does that it's kind of like a
Yeah.
half sentence, but
No, I think I get it. I think also like I can't answer that necessarily because each individual office is going to be a little different. Each individual person is going to be a little bit different. It's where we really want to sort of like power map these folks as much as we can and think through like who are the folks who can help get us to the places that we want to be. There is very little data, right? Like it's conversational. It's in conversation and relationship with advocates for a long time. There are absolutely going to be exceptions to the rules, and there are absolutely going to be elected officials who like it really doesn't matter what you do. They may or may not listen to what you have to say, right? That's why I say it's difficult to influence our federal elected officials, but it is possible. We do sort of see that. There is also just a general, right? Like most elected officials are going to sort of follow the party and or follow like the loudest community voices. And so the more we are able to align with those spaces and help to make that influence, um, there's that. It also is that, politics are kind of politics. Most folks feel like they're very complicated, but actually most people are very similar to each other. And so it's a little of that. But Jessica, I can't swear on anything I ever teach anyone is always going to work. There's always going to be times that it's not going to work. I do think doing something is better than doing nothing in all spaces. And I do think that, voting is the very first step, and it also is not a very effective last step. And so that like continuing to advocate and to show up in spaces is really important.
Would you
Can be
know,
really oh, sorry, Steve, go ahead.
would you know of any like list of, I mean, of course, I echo what you were saying is there's some people that are gonna vote one way, they don't really care what you have to say. Would you happen to have a list of any swing votes that we could really concentrate on? I mean, instead of preaching to the choir or preaching to a wall.
Mhm.
We have some people that we can identify.
Yeah.
I don't have a list.
Yes, Steve, I think that's a really good question. I appreciate that. I cannot give you a list because it's going to depend on the topic, right? Anytime that you're joining a federal advocacy campaign, they should have a list of these are the folks that we think are winnable. This is the place to focus your effort. I think even if a lawmaker is not likely to change their mind, they should still need to hear from you. So even when we're in spaces where like, is my elected official, is Mark Alford going to change his mind because I contact him? Like, I don't know one way or another, but at least I tried, right? I think that that's an important step for advocates. And also, it's okay to have boundaries around like, I'm not going to do it because it's never helpful and it always hurts my feelings, right? So it's kind of like up to the individual person, but each different kind of topic is going to be movable, right? Did we really think 6 months ago that Josh Hawley was going to be the guy saying stuff about Medicaid, Medicare? Like, probably we would have said that was not a useful conversation, may or may not, right? But this is the world we're living in. These are human people that things change. And so I can't tell you who it is that might be flexible because I'm not in relationship with them. But National Low Income Housing Coalition is, FRAC is, et cetera. So those like national folks who are running these campaigns, and Empowers Coalitions can connect you as well as going to be like carrying out a lot of those strategies. And so the information we have about each of those campaigns are going to be more thorough than what I know because I'm still in Missouri.
Thank you.
Yeah, does that, okay. So we'll move into judicial review. And at the end of each of these sessions for the next 3 days, we're going to talk about the role of the judicial process and where judicial review can intervene. So the court system is empowered to review legislation changes for violations against the Constitution. Someone with standing, which is what you're going to hear for the next 3 days, right, has to bring a case. So it can't be, I disagree with this policy. It can't be, I disagree with this policy and I advocated around it. It has to be, I am impacted by this policy and it harms me. And I believe it's a violation of my constitutional rights. But that happens all the time, and federal policy can be overturned, right? Here's an example of a few places where Supreme Court rulings against policy made a significant difference. Gideon versus Wainwright established the right to counsel. Brown versus Board of Education desegregated schools. Plessy versus Ferguson, right into Jim Crow social segregation. Dobbs v. Jackson overturned Roe v. Wade, right? This helps ensure that Congress can't just fundamentally change the United States government or our basic civil rights without some overview. That doesn't mean we should fully trust that the court system is always going to do things we like, right? But it does mean that there is a built-in process within the lawmaking process that ensures some level of checks and balances and accountability. So that's the end of our prepared slides. We've got about 10 minutes left for folks who might want to ask any questions or chat or connect at all. Let the introverts sort of simmer.
I got a question. I missed the Missouri webinar on this topic, and perhaps you addressed that. But as a nonprofit, I'm interested in the, what can our 501c3 do versus me personally, and how do we stay out of that? And was that addressed maybe more in that Missouri one, or maybe it's coming up?
Yeah, yeah, it's one of our most common questions. Is it Rondi?
Rondell.
Rondell. Okay. Rondell, it's one of our most common questions. The reality is, as an individual person, you can do whatever you want at all the time, right? And as a C3 nonprofit, you can do a lot of stuff, including an amount of lobbying, that up until endorsing a candidate. I can't tell you exactly how much you can do because the limit from the IRS is based on your overall budget and whether or not you have filed an H exception. Under a general C3, you're allowed to do what they call an unsubstantial part of your business as lobbying. So some portion of your work that they deem insubstantial. That's not a real number. We have no idea what that really means. Usually they say like, the experts, right? Like maybe 5-ish% of your overall budget can be spent on lobbying under that provision. If you file an H exception, you file it one time, it's good for the entirety of your C3. That gives you a hard limit based off of your budget. Then you know like a dollar amount to stay under. I share every single time that question is asked that Empower Missouri is a C3. All we do is advocacy. We do lots of lobbying, and we have never passed that limit for our overall expenditure. There are also a lot of nuances within that, right? So if volunteers are doing the outreach, that is not lobbying. If we're organizing lots of folks to do the outreach, that is, may or may not be lobbying. There's some level of nuance that was really, we didn't really cover today, but we have covered pretty frequently. If you want to send me an email, I'm super happy to like chat with you for 20 minutes and let's, figure out what that looks like for your organization. Not most advocacy is not lobbying. It doesn't become lobbying until we ask for a specific thing. And so lots of the advocacy that we do is completely allowable under a C3. As a person, you can go and do anything you want at any time, even when you're relatively recognizable, right? You just can't wear your organization's logo maybe while you're doing that. It's a little nuanced. It's a pretty well spread fallacy, right? That nonprofits can't do any lobbying. And that fear is instilled because nonprofits have a lot of public trust. Some folks within the lawmaking process somewhere along the line decided that nonprofits should be told that they can't do any lobbying, even though they can do quite a lot of lobbying. So, yeah. Faith, yes, we'll send out at the end of this week these recordings as well as the slides, so you'll be able to review them. If there are no more questions, I'm going to give you 6 minutes of found time back. Here is my email address. If you kind of come up with questions later before we see you tomorrow, feel free to reach out to my email there. I did not put my cell phone number. You can call me. My phone number is in my signature, but feel free to reach out with any questions that kind of come up.
Will we be using the same URL?
Yeah, the same Zoom link.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Good question, Steve. All right. Well, I'm going to hang out for the 5 minutes, but you all should feel free to go on about your days here. Trisha, is there a list of organizations? Oh, Trisha, that's a good question. There's nothing that like you have to start with this organization and follow this path. There are definitely national nonprofits who will organize these campaigns. Usually speaking, especially at a federal level, you're going to be more effective when you're partnered with other organizations or with more voices, right? That's that like visibility aspect. You don't have to do that. Some of this like rental property regulation is really, those are like regulation changes, and we're going to talk about that on Thursday. The regulatory process and the rulemaking process.